request some healing, because if we were in a moment in history in which there were no situations that occurred that were affecting people of color, that would cause the community to question the rightness and the wrongness of actions, we wouldn't have all of the upset right now in this way that we have. But we do because of the history and because of the lack of trust and because of the overprotection that has occurred when there should not have been overprotection. And so I call upon us to call for ourselves healing energy around this issue on both sides, and a stop to the unnecessary harm that has been happening to people of color, and the healing on both sides of people who are supposed to protect individuals and people who are feeling that they are not being protected. So that is what we're holding in this moment of silence now. Thank you. So I want to start as I usually do with some reflection. It was an interesting meeting last week about microaggressions. And I have to tell you that today my braids are all taken loose and not one person has asked to feel my hair yet. So I want to know if anybody walked away with some feelings after last week or any thoughts that they had around microaggressions. Anything that came up, and remember that you can put something in the chat or you can raise your hand physically or electronically, and Tanya's going to be looking for you. We don't hear you, Tanya, but.
Christine Lowry.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead, Christine.
Just because nobody else is jumping in to say anything. Last week was incredibly powerful. And each week, the way that you're guiding this discussion, Cindy, is deepening and deepening and deepening the very strong feelings of what has happened. I don't even know how to express it. The deepness, the heart touching of these feelings that come up with the way that human beings have been treated. It's very powerful, and I just want to thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else?
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about, Cindy, I think I emailed you, is I think and I've been noticing this among some of my white brothers and sisters in these conversations, for me, that delicate balance between not being so anxious and walking on eggshells as a white person to say the wrong thing. And on the other hand, on the other side of that, being open to being called on when I say, something that is not sensitive to, the issue at hand, where I'm superimposing my white privilege. And I find that a real razor's edge. Like, I don't want to be walking around in a state of anxiety to the point that I'm not sharing my genuine feelings. On the other hand, I want to do it in a way where I can, confidently say what I need to say, but also be completely receptive to being called on. Well, John, you kind of stepped across a line there. John, you didn't say this in a way that was sensitive to people of color. And I find that's kind of a razor's edge for many of us. And that has come up in several of these conversations.
Do you feel that safety here, John?
Oh, I feel it. Absolutely. I feel it here. And in other places in the larger world, it's more of a challenge for me.
Sure. I see Fred has a hand up, Tanya. Fred, you're still muted. There we go.
Okay, I just wanted to follow up. I think, Jonathan, last week you had mentioned about agendas of the people who are exercising these microaggressions. And I think one of the things that have been running through my mind as I've been listening is that goes as well for the individual who is receiving that microaggression and what his or her agenda is in the conversation or exchange that's occurring between the white person, you or me, and the person of color is just as important, because I have found in my own experience that there are certain things that I can say I feel badly about after I say them. But then I also ask myself, well, how was that being, what was the agenda of the person who was receiving that comment? So it's a two-way, without distracting from the significance of the possible injury that microaggressions can inflict. At the same time, for us not to walk around on eggshells, as you're saying. I think I would recommend, I believe we should be tuned in to the other person's agenda.
Good point.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I think that what it also requires, though, is that is that we recognize how they may be receiving something before we say it. That it requires a second thought now. We need to pause and take more reflective time. Sarah, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I'm not quite clear on what you mean by their agenda. So I'll give you a scenario that I have friends who have decided that they are going to put, that they have been used to having a high level of tolerance for microaggressions, and that they're unwilling to have a high level anymore. And so they are going to consciously try and find ways to share what's really happening for them, right? Mm-hmm. Is that, would you call that an agenda? Is that what you're referring to as an agenda? Or what exactly do you mean? Because I appreciate the fact that they want to lower the bar of their sensitivity and say, I am going to be sensitive to what I perceive as microaggressions towards me so people can stop doing it, kind of thing. But is that what you mean by an agenda?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah. Yes, I'm talking to you, Fred. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if it was me or Jonathan. Well, let me take an example. If in the work situation where there is a supervisor and a person who is being supervised, the person who's being supervised is of color, the person who is the supervisor is white. And the person who's being, the employee who's being supervised may have an agenda against supervision per se, okay, regardless of whether or not he or she is receiving these aggressions, but in general will not respond favorably to any kind of supervision or any kind of remarks from a supervisor. So that agenda for me would then somehow or another come into play as to how we are analyzing the person's reaction to what might or might not be a microaggression. Is that
Fred, not to mince words, but I think I actually used the term last week, what is my intention?
Intention, okay.
and I mean, agenda, it can be a little bit pejorative, like, a hidden agenda, but
No,
I was thinking was, is my intention to be comfortable? Is my intention to be liked by this person of color? Is my intention really to understand them as an individual and understand their story? So I'm a little more comfortable with the word, what's the underlying intention of the interaction?
Okay, just to clarify, follow up, the intention of the individual, the intent of the individual who is receiving that, so that the person who is receiving it may be receiving it with a certain intent that is muddying the water, so to speak. Does that, Sarah, help at all?
It does. I think that's we can go on with Cindy's lesson today. I mean, her work today, because there's a lot of video on microaggression and the way things are received. And I just caution us from painting pictures where the person who's receiving the microaggression is actually overly sensitive or overly intentioned for wanting to not be heard anymore by
I wouldn't use the term overly. I would just say something else is in play.
Yeah, I guess I want to make sure, for myself, I want to make sure I don't give myself any excuses. There's no justification. I want to make sure I'm not justifying my behavior when I've done something, when really, even if that person had even if we went back to the agenda version, there's still my action that I'm hoping that I can address. And I guess that's what I was thinking about for myself. So.
Interesting. What came up for me is the fact that the thing that we have to assume is that we do not know the history of the person who has been the receiver of the aggression.
Exactly.
We don't know what they have gone through that ultimately may be presenting itself as someone who is not responsive to any kind of supervisorial feedback. It could be that that person has a history of being mistreated and of having many microaggressions by other people, and that because of that, they have put on a protective armor that presents itself as resistance. And so I think in our looking at what do we see, we have to look deeper than simply what's on the surface.
Exactly.
Any other thoughts that came up for anyone? Okay, well, last week we talked about a couple of different kinds of microaggressions, and we were right at the end of microassault and moving into microinsult. Sarah, were you able to call up that?
Yep, I've got it ready.
Piece. Wonderful. Let's look at that.
Microinvalidation is a comment or action that dismisses the experiences of historically disadvantaged group members. Microinvalidations can happen when, for instance, when a student is lamenting that she wishes there were more Latina faculty, for instance, and the students in the class start rolling their eyes or, oh, come on, get over it, and the professor goes along with the students instead of with the person who made the lament. Another type of microinvalidation, one that we hear a lot about today, is being colorblind. When people say, I don't notice you're black, I don't notice you're Latina, I don't see color. What does that mean? How do you interpret that? What are people saying when they say, I don't notice your race, I don't see color? How do you interpret that?
They're just trying to say that they're not racist, that they don't look at that side of you and they just want to validate you as a person, but it comes off wrong because it's like your race is very much who you are as an individual.
In a lot of my mini classes, I have to do writings, and it's just professors seem to be like don't want to hurt my feelings because I'm an international student, so mine is not that good, especially with my writing. So they they let me go easy. Like I just feel like they have different expectations for international student and just American students. And like a lot of feedback that I get from like my writings is just like not very meaningful, because I just feel like they just try not to hurt my feelings, try to go easy on me. But then by doing that, I just feel like it takes toll on my like development, like my learning, my writing and art stuff.
So what do you do if you are not the person who commits the microaggression as the professor? What if someone else in the classroom commits it?
What I usually do is like I name it. When I hear it in the room, a micro.
So she talks about microinvalidations, where you literally discard the person who is there by the things that you say or by the actions that you have. And there are nuances to that sort of they're the borderline between micro insults and micro invalidations. Oh, I couldn't even tell that you were gay. That's so cool. Or a blind person is around you and you speak louder, as though they can't hear you. Or a Muslim woman comes by and someone apologizes that they can't see her hair. Those are borderline insults invalidating who you are and the makeup of who you are. But I want you to notice these. This piece is called 13 Microaggressions, and it's a quick statement, and you have to listen carefully because they all come very quickly, but they're young actors who are speaking of microaggressions that have occurred to them or people that they know.
Do you speak African? Aren't you from the hood?
Wow. Can I have your hair?
So your dad's the black one, right?
Why do you talk like a white girl?
What do you mean you can't play basketball?
You speak Spanish, you're not black. Why are you such an angry black woman? Can you even comb your hair?
Dance for me.
Is it true what they say about black guys? Hey, what sport do you play?
I thought you were just black.
Why do you act so black?
Hey, girlfriend.
What country in Africa are your parents from?
Call me Papi. Oh my gosh, you're so pretty for a dark-skinned girl. Can I see your ID?
Tell us the black perspective.
Wow.
Fake. Oreo.
Swirl.
One drop.
White girl.
Homie.
Exotic. Sassy. Nappy.
Nigger.
Thank you, Sarah. Those were real. Those were expressions that came from other people, directed at the people who were speaking or people that they knew personally. And those are the kinds of microaggressions that I believe often come from a place of ignorance, but it also comes from a place of tolerance, where we allow ourselves and the people around us to say those kinds of things without thinking twice. Jana, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to say that the N-word is not micro. I mean, maybe in the 50s, 60s, 70s, possibly 80s, people could get away with thinking that that's a microaggression, but that's like, it's pretty violent, I think. It seems like that one should be reclassified to me, you know.
Well,
it's aggressive at this time to say the N-word. I mean, it's not an accident. You didn't grow up thinking it was okay, you know? it is now, it is purposeful, and it is an assault to me. I mean, I think so anyway.
I mean, all of those statements actually fall into the same category of microaggression, microassault, microinvalidation. And what happened with the N-word is a historical kind of change, because it started as a word that was created and was extremely, extremely derogatory and negative and used for slaves by slave owners. And that's where it started. At some point, there was this desire out of protection to claim the word and to use it. I think many young people started using it as something within the community of African American people, as something that was a word of comfort. And I think I'm not supposed to say it, so I can't give it to you how it sounds when you use it that way. But then it became claimed by people who were not African American to help them to be in with other African Americans. So that they would come in and then they would use that term, and it didn't come off the same. Because for many African American people, they felt like, no, this is in our history, which is why I'm saying it's so important to understand the history. This is in our history, and in our history, it hits the heart hard and is not something that feels okay to be able to use. And then there was this outpouring of information that came from the African American community to say, let's explain this to you so that people start to understand it. And then it continued to be used. And then it became an insult and an assault. Mm-hmm. Because then people understood and they were continuing to use it. And then it started to revert back to how it historically was used for slaves, used by some peace officers, used by some teachers, used by some people in authority. And so then it became something that has become extremely derogatory.
So Cindy, Brenda, thank you, Brenda shares that she brings up the concept of cultural appropriation.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. And it was inappropriate. It could not be culturally appropriated by people who were not African American, of African descent.
She also, Brenda, thank you. She also brings to consciousness, inviting us to use the word enslaved instead of the word slaves. And I wonder, my linguistical friends, Sarah's shaking her head, and John, how that really contextualizes our mind map of what we're talking about.
I think it gives us a better emotional understanding of what that means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it puts the action, kind of what Mahadi said in her words about Black Lives Mattering instead of Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. I think that's where language really can be a powerful change agent in the conversation.
Yeah.
Enslaved implies a relationship. One is enslaved and one is a slaver, if you will, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you, Brenda. That's really a powerful piece for all of us to, as we continue the conversation of these microaggressions.
Yes. Okay. Any other thoughts? Any thoughts that came up from the words that you heard?
Well, for me, hearing them over and over again all these years in my own life.
Gotcha. Anyone else come up with things that may have come from you or that you have heard?
I remember reading an article some time ago about an African-American graduate student who had attended Harvard, and 4 times within a very short period when she shared with people, I think white and black, that she'd gone to Harvard, they said, especially among the white people, "You mean the one in Boston?" As though you couldn't possibly have gone to Harvard. Just, it was so subtle, but 4 times they were asked, "Oh, you mean the Boston Harvard?"
Wow. Wow.
I grew up in the South, and many of these sayings were sayings that were things that I heard growing up, and I remember my grandmother talking about that her domestic was high yella, and just so many things like that people just said all the time, and thank God that people are becoming more conscious and aware, and that I have hope when I see a lot of my elders who are changing their language and their understandings and continuing to grow. It does give, when in a time where there's so many things that are pretty terrible, it is also nice to see people realizing that is not, what's not acceptable, and how they can do better and be better. But yeah, very common.
Yes.
I found the word exotic to be an interesting, for me, to hear that as a microaggression, because I think that was a word that I heard a lot growing up. People were exotic, and now to listen to her say it, I went, oh, exotic. Oh, that's other. That's othering. It's like saying you're not just beautiful, you're different. And you're not different in a everyone's different kind of way. You're in a categorizable way. And that I went, yeah, now I hear that. I hadn't heard that before until she said it.
My mother used to have a term for that I never quite understood as a child, but she called it nice nasty. When someone is saying something, and it's nice nasty. It's like,
right.
They're trying to say it's nice, but it really comes off being nasty.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think is interesting is when we recognize the psychological underpinnings of microaggression, it helps us to be able to have a little more understanding, a little more empathy regarding our communications, and we'll take a little bit more care, I think, that we don't give words that negate or nullify thoughts or feelings of people of color. There are some terms that may have come up a little bit last week, but one of them is something called Imposter Syndrome, that was initially a part of some research that was done primarily around Asian Americans, that when people asked where you're born, where you come from, that it creates for the individual the feeling that they don't belong here and that they must be pretending that they're someone who they're not. And that negates the person, negates them racially, negates them culturally. Or when someone says, don't be so sensitive about a particular situation, that it invalidates what they're feeling about what is occurring, and ultimately says, it's okay for this to happen to you. It's okay for somebody to treat you that way. And I can tell you that it's been more than once that I have been in a restaurant.
Oh, Cindy, we lost you. If you can hear me.
Rose.
Yeah.
Oh.
She'll come back.
Here I am.
You are, yay.
I was going to say that it has been more than once that I have had the experience of being in a restaurant and not being served, and feeling like I must have been a character in a movie where I was see-through, and so nobody actually knew that I was there, but I was standing front and center. And I would start to ask, are we taking numbers, or is there a list where you can put your name down, or, you know, that it must be that? And it was neither. And that I would have to go up and to say, I've been waiting, or I've been standing here to be able to be served, which is really, really ridiculous and unnecessary. Or even clearer, I was at a conference somewhere and went to a restaurant. Where were we? I can't remember where it was, somewhere in the South. And I remember getting the bill, handing the person the money, and them giving the change back to the other person at the table. It's like, really? Really? And that's happened to me twice. Handed my credit card went back to the other person at the table, who then handed it to me to sign. I then gave it to the person. The receipt then went to the other person at the table. Like,
Michael has his hand up.
Sure.
I'm sorry. When you're finished, when Cindy's finished.
I know, that was it. I'm good.
Okay. Well, I was going to say that's definitely happened to me before. When my wife and my 3 kids are sitting at restaurants, and I know what the idea is not to nitpick incidents, but I do want to say that has happened to me and my family before, and it's kind of a thing actually with us. When we sit down, I'm kind of almost placing bets on, you know, how long we'll wait, because it just happens. But going back to last week's excerpts that you showed about microaggression, you know, one of the beliefs was that, you know, people of color don't tip. So, you know, that might shed some light on the subject. But I wanted to actually speak about this last week, but I didn't get a chance to because we ran out of time. So I would like to mention, I'd like to kind of ask an open question. These microaggressions, these things that are said, these things that are, you know, that, again, I spoke about it and I said that they come from somewhere. There are beliefs, there are things that are stereotypical. Who knows, maybe something's true on an individual basis that people who are not of color or not Black, you know, don't want to or can't seem to shake. Because, you know, they come at, I experience them. And I'm trying to ask this question correctly. Those things, those are the little foxes that keep getting away from us. I've been saying this. Those little things, those stereotypes, addressing them, you know, whether they're true or not, I guess that nothing can be done with that, you know, because some people are, you know, some of the, I'm losing myself here. Okay, some things are true, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do we get to a place where, you know, people aren't judged by, you know, tendencies of others, whether it's in group, whether it's just a few individuals, because, you know, even I have some prejudices against, you know, people from my own community and my own culture, from my own ethnicity. So I imagine that they're out there for people who of other ethnicities. But some of those beliefs, Black people don't tip, you know, they're lazy, they don't want to work, you know, they're happy to, you know, they're happy that coronavirus conveniently came because now we can collect more than we make on our regular jobs. Absolutely nuts. These things are just not true. You know, how do you catch those things? How do you find out who feels what, and, you know, how do you avert these things? That's all. I mean, I know it's not a question that we can answer now, but just wanted to kind of put that out there.
Any thoughts about that? We'll discuss some of it when we talk about race as a social construct. Okay. But Mike, you're very clear in what you're saying, that they come from somewhere. There's an underpinning. And over time, people continue to drink the Kool-Aid, and they begin to have these beliefs, many of them that they can't even articulate. They're just back there. They're just in there. Yeah. And they shape what people think and what they do. And so I think that it's really important to name it and to become educated about them, and to really look at what's the history behind what you say.
Absolutely.
Well, that's why I think it's so important for everyone to do their implicit bias work, you know, to really take a look at what little thought forms do I have in there that may not be true at all, or may not be based on anything that's real or sensitive or respectful. And then creating a culture where people can be called on it in a firm, honest, but emotionally safe way, where it doesn't cause more relationship disruption. But no, we're going to create an environment where it's okay to be called on this, because we're trying to change it.
Yes. There's an interesting quote in a piece of research that I read that says, it's not the overt racists, the white supremacists, the Klan, the skinheads, the outright bigots. The outright bigots are less likely to affect the standard of my living than the individuals who seem to be well-intentioned, educators, employers, healthcare providers who are unaware of their own biases. Yeah. And so when we talk about really needing to put ourselves in check, that's a piece that's important, that we can't continue to hide behind, well, you know, we didn't mean it. We need to find out. We need to find out how microaggressions are closely tied to our own implicit biases and how they affect how we think and what we say, and attitudes, stereotypes, and assumptions that we didn't even know that we had, or that were just kind of in our family, that creep into our mind and affect our actions.
Yeah, and then Cindy, they become habitual. We have a few comments in the chat that are worthy of comment or reading. Brenda says you can start with self-examination and the fact that we do live in such a segregated world and are oftentimes willing to believe stereotypes for a variety of reasons. And then Glenda shares, I think just speaking about it and bringing it to consciousness is a first step to healing. Thanks for sharing these thoughts and experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. We need the help of other people sometimes to be able to bring those things to our consciousness. There's something that is now called the thoughts about people that you didn't know you had. And it is the reflection that people have to take who may have passed the Harvard bias tests, but still have biases that they didn't quite recognize were there, that they didn't even know that they had them. But we can't avoid it. And that's a piece that's really important. Sarah, there's another video. And you called that up.
Are we jumping to, can you remind me which one it is? Because I'm looking at your list and I just want to make sure I hit the right one.
Am I in the list of what happens when we avoid addressing microaggressions?
Great. Yep, that's what we are.
Okay.
And while we're looking, I'll just say, good point, Jonathan, from Susan Fitzpatrick, becoming more acceptable to call these things out without more damage to the relationship. Some tips, please, for the best way to do this without causing offense or judgment. So you can think about that.
You know, first of all, let me say that almost all, if we talk about racial microaggressions, our studies indicate when we've watched these dynamics in the classroom, that almost all difficult dialogues on race occur because a microaggression has occurred in the classroom. Whether it is a curriculum that portrays certain groups in negative fashion and students of color get upset about it, whether the teacher unknowingly makes a microaggression, or when other students in the classroom make a microaggression, it tends to create the difficulties that is going on. And by avoiding them or handling them poorly, creates a lot of psychological consequences to students of color. These studies, what I'm going to show you is that racial microaggressions in the classroom, if not facilitated well, will assail the mental health of the recipients. In one of the major studies that we conducted at Teachers College, we found frustration, anger, depression, anxiety, all the results that many students of color experience if the teacher was unable to accurately acknowledge and facilitate the difficult dialogue. They create a hostile and invalidating campus climate. And this has been shown to be really, detrimental, that the campus climate for many students of color, whether in elementary, secondary, high school, institutions of higher education, the classroom climate and the campus itself can be hostile to the group identities of those people who are feeling assailed or attacked in one way or another. It perpetuates stereotype threat. The studies that Claude Steele and many others have done on stereotype threat indicate the detrimental consequences by lowering educational productivity and learning and experience or functioning. They interfere with classroom learning. Microaggressions have major consequences. When you, as a student of color, are feeling invalidated, invisible, assailed, your identity is assailed, you are expending considerable psychological energy into protecting yourself, into constantly reaffirming yourself that I'm all okay. And having to ward that off. When that happens, there is little psychological energy left for learning and productivity in the classroom, and we found that it interferes. Likewise, if you look at the impact, we're not just talking about psychological effects. Studies are beginning to indicate that racial microaggressions tend to create detrimental physical consequences or health consequences for individuals of color. And you can look at a number of studies, even in adulthood, where racism can be, for many African Americans, high blood pressure, lowered life expectancy. All of these things are the results of the constant bombardment of racial microaggressions that I'll soon define.
Cindy, this is where you wanted me to stop. Would you like to keep going?
No, we're good right there. Thank you, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
What I want you to know about those studies, and there were many of them that came out at the same time, is that they were done 10 to 15 years ago. And you'd think, because his work specifically had to do with educators and microaggressions in the classroom, and his work looked at from elementary all through grad school, and what happens to students, children and adult students when they have been experiencing microaggressions. And so when you talk about, and I have to go back to the earlier comment when Fred was talking about intention, when you think about a student who has been receiving these microaggressions, and last week we talked about teeny tiny paper cuts, but you get 1 million of them over time. And when he talked about the feelings that end up coming up, anger, et cetera, that build up, put that many years past elementary school into the adult, and imagine what you get when people start to say things to you, or when you're preparing yourself, arming yourself. Have you ever met people for whom you say, boy, she walks around protected like somebody's about to attack her or something like that? It's this build up of so many microaggressions that happen on a regular basis that over time become life-changing and experience-changing and psychologically damaging to an individual. And he did his work for educators to recognize that it happens with children, that it happens with educators and children. There are little things that we say, that we do, that we don't pay attention to. In the city that I live in, the school district just changed their remote learning company because the company had various things, and some parents brought it to my attention. I had them go to the district about it. But one of the things, for example, is that they taught the history of Harriet Tubman, and they taught that Harriet Tubman was a criminal, and that she kidnapped people, and that was her life history. That she was a criminal, people were out to look for her because she kidnapped people, and completely undermined the entire idea of enslavement and what happened and freedom and the whole 9 yards. And believe it or not, in 2020, we had that information going out to students. And parents, fortunately, happened to have been home seeing and listening to some of the things that were going on and saying, what in the world? How in the world, how more does this information exist, that this company is in existence, that they are putting out this information? And listen to the fact that this was for remote learning. So this wasn't old information for another time period. This was information brought into this time period and being shared with children. And so one of the first things that he mentioned was that it was really incumbent upon us to look at our curriculum, to look for the small pieces within our curriculum, to look at the small bits of information that we share with other people, that the ways that we see our students, our expectations of our students, the small things that can end up being microaggressions when they are very young, that can end up affecting them later. Any thoughts about that?
Fred has his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to link what you just now said, explain to what we just heard with the plea for more pictures in the classroom of people of color, which I guess would be more or less a passive macroaggression on the part of the classroom, in the sense that it's not something that is being overtly said, such as with Harriet Tubman, that she was a kidnapper, but what is not being said and or not being shown. And I don't know if that has a category separate from microaggression, and if so, what might it be?
Well, if you mean the lack of information and pictures and things like that in the classroom, that's a microinvalidation.
Invalidation, okay.
Yes, yes, yes. African Americans do not exist. They did not make a contribution. There is this wonderful book, Sarah, the book that I think you showed me about the African contribution to America or something like that.
Our Black American founding fathers.
Yes, yes. It would be an interesting book for everyone to read for themselves. Can you say it again, Sarah?
Our Black American founding fathers. Quite a lot of contribution there.
Yes, yes. So there's another take, which I thought is really interesting, is because he goes further in his research as to whether or not microaggressions are harmful to people who are white. Sarah, can you go there?
Yes.
Benjamin also talked about is that microaggressions in the classroom also have harm, although very invisible to white students and white folks as well. And this is a point that is lost frequently in the conversation. We ask people to change for the benefit, so the harm isn't attributed to, just to people of color. But in essence, we have to, in some sense, harm from racism, racial microaggressions, sexism, homophobia. All of these have detrimental consequences to the majority group population as well. And some of the findings that have come out is that it lowers empathic ability. It the person who perpetuates or delivers a microaggression doesn't have empathic ability when someone says, I found it offensive, well, that was such a small thing. What are you, the empathic ability is not there. It also dims perceptual awareness, because as I've written before, one of the greatest tasks that we as psychologists have is to make the invisible visible. Microaggressions, when you commit a subtle act of racism in one form or another, it is outside the level of your awareness. And this is something that I'm going to be talking about very shortly, that indeed, what is the greatest obstacle for us to move together in dealing with these disparities is the fact that most people who deliver microaggressions experience themselves as good, moral, decent human beings who would never discriminate against others. They are unaware that they are delivering microaggressions in one form or another. So the perceptual awareness is not there. And as long as you never correct it, that will increase in terms of being perceptually unaware of what is going on. It maintains what I call a false illusion. Many of you, and we can talk about why is it, why is the worldview, if we talk about racism, why is the worldview of white Americans so different from the worldview of people of color? They are differences between them. And part of it is that people who experience discrimination, prejudice, stereotyping, who are on the receiving end of microaggressions, see it. But the perpetrators, because of their worldview, don't see it. In fact, that is one of the ironies of microaggressions, that on the surface, they appear like compliments. When I'm complimented, Daryl, you speak excellent English. The perpetrator isn't meaning to insult me. They think that they are, but they don't realize that they have delivered a microaggression with a hidden message. And that message is that you are a perpetual alien in your own country. You are not a true American. These might seem on the surface, and when you raise that with an individual, what do they come back with? What an oversensitive person this is. So the reaction becomes pathologized and represents another form of microaggression, because you are imposing, the perpetrator imposes their racial reality upon the less powerful individual or group that is going on. That's where the pain and difficulty begins to occur. It lessens compassion for others. And that is one of the things that happens. Microaggressions lessens compassion for others. You don't, big deal. You just don't feel that way in one way or another. In other words, microaggressions, unless they are dealt with adequately as a learning opportunity in the classroom, tends to continue the false illusion that no one, that all people are well-intentioned and do not harm others, that real racists are skinheads, that they aren't good, decent human beings like you and I. And that is one of the things that I want to really concentrate on. Here are some
examples. And I want to submit that this has already happened. That over the course of time, because this has not been a piece that has brought to the forefront, because it has not been something that, I think there are the people who have been trying to hail these aspects of racism for quite some time, but because it isn't something that has been put in front of us, that has been taught, that it hasn't been undone, that because of that, we have continued to perpetuate these kinds of things that are microaggressions. And what he talked about, I think, is very true, that what results is a lack of empathy, that people can't quite connect by putting their feet in someone else's shoes to say, oh, this is how this may have hit you. That the perceptual awareness is just not there. Wow, didn't get that would mean anything. And that without correcting it, that it increases, because we have been who we are, and then our children and our children's children and children's children, you know, and it just goes on and on and on, where we have over time begun to give practices in our family without explanation that just become the norm, and that we then carry those in life, and we just perpetuate something that becomes swallowable and acceptable within populations. And it changes our worldview. And I loved the part where he mentions that. It changes our worldview, because our worldview then becomes that is a part of acceptable language, and that's appropriate. And he said that we end up with a binaryism that ends up occurring, where people of color have a different worldview than people who have been perpetuating the microaggressions. And so that just exacerbates the inability to be able to understand it and to see it for what it is and to do something about it. I can remember, oh, go ahead, Tanya.
I was just going to share, because we have some comments that directly relate to what you're bringing to our consciousness. And Brenda shares, the brain is more malleable than previously thought, and poverty and racism, etc., have deleterious effect to the whole person. And then our microaggressions can be as simple or as difficult as misspelling your students' names. Because of I before E, except. And
mispronouncing them.
And mispronouncing them, yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Or asking them, where did that name come from?
Yes. Yes, I think I've shared before, my given name is Cheryl Linda. And my father was illiterate, so he didn't know how to spell it. And so it comes out on legal documents as Shirlinda, which people pronounce Sherlinda, which is not what my name is. My name is the combination of Cheryl and Linda. For a while in elementary school, I used to spell it with an E, and sometimes I still do, because people would tend to pronounce it better at some point. If they saw the E there, they would think maybe that it was Cheryl as opposed to Sher. But Cindy became a name that my parents started to call me, because they ended up liking it better than Cheryl Linda anyway. My father continued to call me that. My mother called me Cindy. And so I held on to Cindy as the identification, because it became so tiring to continue to say, no, it's Cheryl Linda, and then to have people say, that's not what it looks like. No, it's not, but that's my name. It's not that it's not my name. Don't say it's not my name. You know, it is my name, and it is spelled like that. That's just how it is. And to question that is to question my identification. It's to question who I am. You know, is it Sherlinda? I went through elementary school allowing all of my teachers to say Sherlinda, because I just felt like I couldn't undo it, and so I just became that, and sometimes identified myself that way. And we don't want to do that to people. We just don't want to do that. Okay. Anything up there in the chat?
Yeah, Brenda also, well, Daniel says trauma with a capital and shout it out. Brenda says, I think folks hold on to stereotypes in part to protect whatever they might feel might be in jeopardy, or there's not enough of wealth, land, etc. I think the whole idea of whiteness, which is a social construct as well, is directly tied into privilege. And I'm going to add power, that institutional racism looks at power and who's in power and how do we keep our power. And it does translate into our classrooms, Cindy, when we are looking at a hierarchy of organization. If it's my classroom or my materials, or, you know, those words in some ways also share a level of power.
Yes.
Grabbing and holding on to.
Yes. Yes. And I would say that for any teacher in any classroom, if you haven't started your school year learning about the background of the children in your school, you have, in the children in your classroom, you have done them a disservice. It shouldn't be that you're wondering or not wondering at the end of the school year. You should know that. You should know who they are, what their culture means, how they manifest that, the language that they speak, what are words of the heart in their language that you can incorporate in the classroom. And those are things that are important to the identification of children, and that we get it right, that we really understand it and we get it right, that we pronounce names right, that we understand. You know, there are some cultures in which many people are called aunt, or many people are called cousins. And no, it's not your cousin in terms of your blood cousin, but in many cultures, it's just as strong. And so it is, and that we don't question that. What does that mean? Is that really your sister, or is it not? It just is, and that we need to come to understand those kinds of things. I'll share one more personal, I told you last week that I call them parts of my wisdom history, and a part of my wisdom history that was definitely a microaggression was something that happened with my daughter and my son-in-law. My eldest daughter, Jen, I call Jen my hippie daughter because Jen is someone who, she absolutely loves that era. She loves tie-dye and peace signs and all of that kind of stuff, and that's how she is and how she dresses. Jen she works from her garden, she eats everything organic, and she likes to write notes and hand them to people that just says, peace be with you, and we love you, and that kind of stuff. That is Jen. And for most people looking at Jen, they can't make the connection between the Black girl and the hippie presentation that she has for herself. My son-in-law is white, and my son-in-law loves reggae music. He only likes colors that are red, green, and black. If you walk into their house, that's how their walls are painted, one green, one red, and one yellow. And he likes to wear things that have Africa on them, and you name it, that's my son-in-law. One day I said, it's so funny, the two of you have just switched, and Pat, you are so Black, and Jen, you are so white. And they caught me up very quickly. And my daughter said, this is what Black looks like in this body. And Pat said, and this is what white looks like. I am not Black, I'm a white man, and these are the things that I love, and this is how I am. And it was my moment. It was my moment of wisdom history, and I said, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to grow up to be like you. Thank you so much. That's what I say back to them. And you know, it's a way that we all have to learn. We all have those pieces that are just learning moments. So is there anyone else that has a piece like that they'd want to share before we go on?
Susan shares a little bit about power. She quotes better than-ness. She says, I am a moral, well-meaning person and don't want to be seen otherwise. It is uncomfortable. Tone judges as other than this version of myself, which is what your daughter and your son-in-law got to. It's this version of themselves and who they are becoming and what they choose to do. And yes. I think that you know, schools tend to obliterate that. They don't want that kind of uniqueness.
Yeah, exactly. So how can we be more responsible? A few of those researchers point out 5 things. The first one is to be constantly vigilant of your own biases and your fears. Call yourself up on things, but listen to yourself. Sometimes, especially when we get nervous, we can just become mouth runners where we just continue to say something. And this is a time in which it's okay to be in more quiet reflection and to pay attention to the things that actually come out. 2, seek out interaction with people who differ from you. My upper elementary students for International Day of Peace sent out a note to the newspaper saying, we think that people should spend every day saying one complimentary thing to someone who doesn't look like them. And if we continue to seek out interactions with people who differ from us in race and culture and ethnicity and abilities and qualities, we become richer. We become richer people. And it helps us to put stereotypes in check and in a place and to say, well, yes, actually, all people are not like this. That we try to lessen our defensiveness. That was number 3. And Sarah, can you show that next piece very quickly?
Yes, that piece was the don't be defensive piece, yes.
Yeah. And while Sarah's calling that up, number 4 was to be open and prepared for discussion. Because research shows that it's the connection to teacher training programs and the classroom setting. So Sarah, just that one piece, and then we'll go right to the next one.
I think one of the things that we need to add to that as well is that for those who hear that microaggression has occurred or that you're feeling a certain way, don't dismiss it. That's the other thing. You don't have the empathy. Others say you're overreacting or that's not what this person meant. And the person who is the perpetrator becomes the victim because the person who is on the receiving end is overreacting. So if you're a bystander, you need to also be a part of the solution and have those conversations and start those conversations really early on in life and continue with those conversations throughout education. I believe that this is something that should be threaded through our educational system in order for real change to happen.
It's an important conversation to have. I want to thank you both for.
Thank you, Sarah. And so she talked about not being defensive and not being defensive to the point that you then make yourself the victim because you're saying, you know, I wasn't trying to do anything and they got upset and so that hurt my feelings, that we just step back a little bit and that we really try to listen, and that if we are a bystander, then we allow it to continue. And so rather than being a bystander, that we learn how to call things out. Sarah, the next one.
Very anxious when they have to talk about issues that deal with racism, gender sexism, heterosexism. These are all things that push buttons in people so that the classroom dynamics, when issues of these occur, tend to be haphazard in many respects. Racial dialogues in the classroom, one of the greatest fears that teachers have is that racial dialogues in the classroom will produce antagonism and conflict between either the teacher and the students or among students themselves. And as a result, they try to dampen it down. When a topic of race, sexual orientation occurs and the dynamics become heated, many teachers tend to try to cut off the dialogue in any number of different ways, either telling the students that we have to talk to each other respectfully, that we should talk about this outside, come into my office to do it, but there is an attempt and a fear to somehow dampen down the dialogue on a difficult dialogue such as this before it gets out of control. And this leads me to the second major fear that we find teachers experiencing that makes them avoid talking about these topics. The fear is that they will lose control of the classroom dynamics, and it will become the classroom from hell, where students march out to the principal demanding that the teacher be fired, or to the dean in higher education. This is really one of the greatest fears that educators have, that in a classroom that deals with a topic like this, that it will become the classroom from hell and the teacher will lose control. And as a result, feel very badly about this particular situation. One thing that we find is that in our studies, it is not that teachers are to be blamed for not being able to facilitate a difficult dialogue on race. What they are fearful of is that they want to do well. They want to facilitate the dialogue so that it is a learning lesson for the students, but they are paralyzed because they do not know what to do. And I think that all of you, all of us who have gone through education, schooling, know that teachers are ill-equipped to deal with the emotive aspects in the classroom dynamics. In fact, we're taught oftentimes that teaching is a matter of cognitive development and inquiry, mastery of content. And in some sense, when you deal with an emotional topic like race, gender, sexual orientation, the teacher, fairly or not, has to be someone who understands process and almost has to play the role of being a group therapist. Because that is what is the dynamic that is occurring among the students. And unless you're able to deal sufficiently with the emotional aspects of this, it becomes a very difficult task. In general, many teachers try to avoid or cut off dialogues on race, gender, and sexual orientation. But the silence or the avoidance of the topic leaves what I call the elephant in the room that no one acknowledges or wants to talk about. And it can hang in the classroom and create a number of...
Trevor. Thank you. So he talks about some of the reasons why it doesn't come up, or why teachers try to avoid it coming up. And I want to say that we're talking about race as it connects in our preschool up environments, and we're talking about race as it connects in teacher training programs, rolling teachers out to be in classrooms. That we fear what it's going to be like. We fear that in staff meetings, we fear that in teacher training programs, we fear that in the classroom. We don't want to say too much because we're concerned about how it's going to happen, if we're going to lose control, if somebody's going to go tell the parents. Certainly that has happened in many public schools where teachers have talked about race and parents got upset and it ended up in the news. And that we're used to mastery as educators, that we know our material, we know what to do, and we know how it's going to end up going, and that when we don't feel like we have that mastery over this topic, then we fear bringing it up. But it's a piece that just needs to be there, as he called, it's the elephant in the room. Even if you're in a Montessori school with a predominantly Black community, because there are levels of microaggression that children still experience from the outside, levels within the Black community, and microaggressions that their parents may feel that the child ends up having to deal with on a subconscious level, because it's on a subconscious level with their parents, it still enters your school and it's still something that you have to deal with. So it's it's a piece. It's a piece that feels a little scary, but it's there, and it's something that we have to open up. Any thoughts that come up about that?
Cindy, for the second time, Susan Fitzpatrick has brought up the idea on the sort of the semantics or language level, whether it's calling people out on their microaggressions, or in this case, how a teacher negotiates this in the classroom when this comes up. I'm wondering in a future session whether we could actually talk about the language of how you do this. And I want to try to paraphrase what Susan said, without rupturing or hurting relationships or coming across as judgmental. I think we can all agree that we need to have ourselves called and others called out, but unless we have the language to do that in a supportive, firm but emotionally safe way, we don't know how to negotiate that. And I think Susan's points are huge, and I'm wondering whether we can address it at some point.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, we can do that. Any other thoughts that have come up for anyone? Okay, so back to those things that we want to work on. We want to try to be open and prepared for discussions. And Jonathan raised a very wonderful part that we can help. We can help with that by talking about how we can roll that out, how we can have particular language that we can use. Be open to discussing your own attitudes and your own biases. And how they may have hurt others, or revealed a bias that you didn't quite realize that you had, or revealed a knowledge to you about microaggressions. Because if you share your experience, you help somebody else. And you start to undo the history of that particular thing that gets said. You correct it. And if we continue to do that, we help to correct those things. And that finally, that we can be allies, that we can help other people. When I mentioned before about having someone who is a coach, who just holds those kinds of informations to be able to help people to hear ways that we can do something differently, how we can make life smarter, and to be an ally in the sense that you speak up rather than being a bystander when something occurs. Even if you know it's unintentional, that you're the person who helps to provide the information to educate all of us. And that's a piece that I think is just really, really important for us. There are minor things that we can end up addressing in classrooms, because we have more and more people who speak more than one language here. I mean, in our school, we have changed the wording foreign language to cultural language, because they're not foreign. All people are here. And so it's just another language that happens to not be English. But there are tiny microaggressions that can end up coming up with people who have English as a second language, and their pronunciation may be different, or their understanding of the terminology may be different, or they may not completely understand information that is going on, or they may, and we may make the assumption that they don't, simply because English is their second language. All of those kinds of things can end up being microaggressions, in which we need to look at that. And that's one that comes up a lot right now in schools, because there are so many people who, for whom English is a second language now.
Cindy,
yes.
Cindy, I want to share a couple of things that have been going on in the chat. One is that Kimber Phillips, thank you, Kimber, has completed a Healing from Internalized Whiteness course. She says it's a 10-week online training for white allies committed to racial justice and collective liberation. Teaches one how to be able to begin a safe dialogue. She's done the links. She says you can join it with a sliding scale fee, and she found it a positive experience. And then Glenda shares, I think we can also ask our Black friends to please bring to our attention when we say something appropriate. Give them permission to call us out.
That's an interesting thought. To call it out when someone says something that is appropriate.
Or
Am I
isn't
correct?
Inappropriate.
Oh, that's inappropriate. Okay.
Inappropriate.
Okay. Okay. Yes, understood. Understood. Any other thoughts that people want to share about how this has hit you? Jonathan, did you have something that you wanted to share before as well?
Yeah, I have a microaggression confession. And I think Sarah has the slide. It goes back to when I did that in-service at your school. So let me get this off my chest. Yeah, Sarah, I think you've got it.
I do. I have it right here. I'm ready to share it.
So Sarah was my mentor on this one. So Cindy asked me to come in and give a little presentation, just a review, especially for people who have not had formal Montessori training on her staff, the teachers, on just some of the essential elements of Montessori philosophy and practice. And so one of the ones I got to was this one. And I was trying to get across here about what this student might be thinking. And because I had already made the assumption in my white male brain that this was an African-American male, I started into he, and then halfway through the sentence, I went, wait a minute, I'm actually not sure that this is a male. And Sarah immediately and rightly cut me off and said, John, it really doesn't matter. It's a them. And I'm thinking, you know, had this person been in the room with me, it would have been offensive. I was simply, you know, siding in my male gender white thing with like, well, this must be a male. Oh, I guess it's not. It does it, you know, and then I started to try to figure it out. And it was, even though this is a piece of clip art from Google, it was still a microaggression because I had just was launching into something that had made no real difference, you know. So
Gotcha.
That's my story. And thank you, Sarah.
Sarah, you were about to say something just before that. Thank you, John.
Oh, it passed. I don't remember.
Okay.
I was so interested in John's story.
Okay. Any other thoughts that someone has? Okay, I want to
Deidre?
end this.
Oh, you know,
go ahead.
I did have raised her hand.
Sure.
I just wanted to say that I have been trying to seek out interactions with people of color that I ordinarily wouldn't have as I pass them on my hiking or wherever I am. And I happened to go to a new dentist recently, and the dentist assistant who was cleaning my teeth happened to be African American, Black, or a person of color. I didn't know her from Adam, but I thought, yes, okay, this is my opportunity. So the first thing I said to her, not knowing her at all, was, wow, you must be really excited about this racial reckoning that's going on. And she was taken aback, I could tell. She was very diplomatic. She just sort of went, uh-huh, and that was it. And afterwards, I realized I couldn't have picked a more confrontational message to get to know somebody. You know, I was very excited about it. What I should have said was, you know what, I am so excited about this racial reckoning and all the things that I'm, trying to better in myself. But I didn't do that. I put it all on her. You must be very excited. And of course, she may not be, or she doesn't know who I am. So why is she going to be vulnerable to me? So that really, I got that message loud and clearly. In a very
Understood. Yeah, or you might have simply said, hi, nice to see you in the office.
I know, I couldn't. That's what I should have said. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
But there's this charge, this tension and charge around the whole thing. So what came out was something that reflected my own, emotional situation about the whole thing.
Sure, understood. Okay. Anyone else?
Kimber wants to thank you, Deidre.
Thank you for sharing that, by the way.
Yeah, thank you so much and sharing your vulnerability.
Yeah. So I'm going to.
I think Arlette has a has a question or a thought.
And I'm just going to bring to consciousness we're 4 minutes to wrapping up, kind of, sort of. In my culture, time is fluid.
Okay.
Go ahead, Arlette.
Yeah, I think, Deidre, what you said, you must be very excited. I got to tell you, my initial take on that when I heard you, it was offensive to me because the way I interpret it, it's sort of like, okay, because it came from, it sounds like judgment, receiving it, okay? Not saying that's what you did at all, but that is how I would take it, because it's like, I guess the choice, the word to say that you must be very excited, or if you had said, well, how do you feel about that? Then that would make me feel more open and like, oh, wow, you care about how I feel, to talk about it. But to say I must be excited because of what's going on, I think a lot of people who are Black, who are Black Lives Matter, are getting this, this, just people are saying, you guys are way too much, way too much about this. You're too hype. This is too much hype. So to even use that word excited, it just opens up something in someone of color, because it's like, no, we're not excited. We're very, concerned, or we're glad it's getting the attention. However, to say, well, how do you feel about it? Or like you said, to put yourself in it and say, how you personally feel would have gotten a better response, and would have made her feel like, wow, I'm so glad we're talking about this. And, because I can tell you, being Black, when, white folks open up about what's going on, it really makes us feel like, wow, you really care. So yeah, I just want to share that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to end this part with a quote from a professor at the University of Washington on microaggressions and racial bias. He says, the United States society provides far from the best of circumstances. At the nation's birth, people found a way to celebrate democracy, freedom, and equality while owning slaves and destroying indigenous populations, and then found ways to erase many of these horrors from the nation's collective memory. Yet, as James Baldwin said of this history, we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. And so I think that's the piece that we have to really hold on to about microaggressions, so that we can undo this history, or hold the history and change the history. So next week is an educational lesson, unless you consider this one also an educational lesson, because we're going to talk about race as a social construct. Where did it come from? Who created that? And how did people buy into it to the extent that we actually have had such an incredible change? And I also want to read you a poem. Yes.
Do you want, you had on your notes a list of information and books for educators. Would you like me to put that in the post, or is that for next week?
No, that is for now. I actually thought that was going in there.
It is now.
Terrific. And I want to say to you, and this probably doesn't sound very Montessori of me, but there is it's a horror movie to me, but I cry at Disney movies. And it's called Get Out. And if you haven't seen that movie, and if you don't like that kind of stuff, I don't suggest you watch it. But my daughter and I watched it because it shows many microaggressions. And so if you sort of watch it to take it apart, it's kind of an interesting thing to do. But I do say, if you don't like sci-fi horror kinds of stuff, it's probably not the the thing for you to watch. The things that I had Sarah putting into the chat are references that I think that are really helpful for educators and about microaggressions that if you wanted to take a look at, I think would be really, really helpful to be able to do. And just before I send you off with a poem, Sarah, do you want to get ready my thing that I put up? I am someone who does not ascribe to, I don't do Facebook. I have one. My son puts most of my things on Facebook because he thinks I ought to have a Facebook account. But I came across something that that has a piece of profanity in it, but I think that it's very descriptive of myself. And so I wanted to share it with you in my honor of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, the contributions that she made to the world are just absolutely incredible. And so Sarah, if you can show my
the blue
post.
one? It's the blue post, right?
Cindy, what was the name of the professor from University of Washington whose quote you quoted?
Oh, I'd have to look it back. I'm fine to say that next week.
Okay, great. Thank you for asking, Kathleen.
Sure. And Sarah,
Cindy, it's the blue piece, right?
Blue as in color blue?
Yeah, well, here it is.
That's it. It says, I am not a liberal snowflake. My feelings aren't fragile. My heart isn't bleeding. I am a badass believer in human rights. My toughness is in tenderness. My strength is in the service of others. There is nothing more fierce than formidable unconditional love. There is not a thing more courageous than compassion. But if my belief in equity, empathy, goodness, and love indeed makes me or people like me snowflakes, then you should know winter is coming.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you, Sarah. And so I'm going to close with a poem about Ruth Bader Ginsburg that is just beautiful. And Sarah, I don't know if you have the picture up about her that you can pull up.
You?
Because she is someone who definitely reminds me of that piece. If she had lived, whoops, I just lost one. Oh, there we go. If she had lived 100 years, it would have been too few. In a world where women are expected to comply, she said, I dissent. In a world where love has been kept in a box with rules, she said, I dissent. In a world where borders are drawn tighter and walls are built higher, she said, I dissent. In a world where fiction is told as truth and facts are twisted into lies, she said, I dissent. And so on a night when it feels like the pendulum has swung off its fulcrum, like there is no place to make a U-turn, like the darkness is winning, I will say loudly, so as to convince myself, I dissent. For decades, she stared unafraid into the faces of misogyny, homophobia, xenophobia, and bigotry, daring them to blink. She wrote reams and spoke volumes and did push-ups while her detractors, I don't know, ate cheeseburgers or whatever. So because she did, I can. Because she did, I will. Tonight feels like the end of something, but it doesn't have to be. This is a moment that instead of being the death of hope, can be the birth of a renewed zeal. Giving up feels very easy, even warranted, but it also feels disrespectful to her memory. We can take this moment and turn it into a movement. We can, like the notorious RBG, dissent. We can, like her, dissent until the very breath leaves our bodies. Thank you, Honorable Justice Ginsburg. You fought harder and longer than you should have had to for us, and we are so grateful. Rest well, you earned it. Oyez, oyez, oyez. Tonight we cry, but tomorrow we rise. So thank you so, so much. We will see you next week. If you know of people who need to learn about race as a construct, or don't quite know that it has not always been here, please invite them to come this, I believe next week it will still be this same time, and we will do some major education of people. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Cindy, for everything. And Sarah, thank you. We really appreciate each and every one of you for coming and sharing and putting ourselves out there. Have a great weekend.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Someone is asking where they can find the RBG